Today, we're taking a deep dive into brain's absolutely fascinating language network. We're going to meet the specific captains in charge of your speech and find out what happens when they, or crucially, the connections between them, suddenly go offline. So let's start with something I think we've all felt. You've been there, right? That incredibly frustrating moment when you know exactly the words you want to say. It's just floating there, right on the edge of your consciousness, but your brain just refuses to spit it out. Okay, now take that temporary frustration and imagine it wasn't temporary at all. What if that became your permanent reality? Losing the power to form words, or maybe even losing the ability to understand the people you care about most. Well, this profound and often isolating loss of language is a condition called aphasia. To really unpack this, we're going to move through 4 parts. First, we'll meet the 2 captains of your language team. Then we'll see what happens when one of them can't do their job. After that, we'll explore what happens when the connection between them breaks down. And finally, we'll zoom out to see the bigger picture of this incredibly delicate language network. All right, let's jump right into our first section, the brain's 2 language captains. I want you to think about your ability to use language as if it's run by a 2-person team. You've got one person in charge of actually producing the speech, and another who's in charge of understanding it. So, first up is the producer. This is Broca's area, and it's located right here in what's called the inferior frontal gyrus. A good way to think about this area is like the assembly line in a factory. It's responsible for the nuts and bolts motor programming of speech, getting your lips, tongue, and vocal cords to move in just the right way to form the words you're thinking. And our second captain is the comprehender, Wernicke's area, found back here in the posterior superior temporal gyrus. So if Broca's area is the factory's assembly line, Wernicke's area is the blueprint department. Its job is to decipher the meaning of the words you hear and read, to make sense of it all. These 2 work together, and they're the absolute core of our language skills. So we've met the captains. Now what happens when one of them gets taken out of the game? This is where we get into the real nitty-gritty of Broca's aphasia versus Wernicke aphasia. This table really lays out how incredibly different these conditions are. With Broca's aphasia, the assembly line is broken, so the speech is non-fluent, really slow and effortful. But, and this is key, their comprehension is pretty good. Now look over at Wernicke's aphasia. Here, the blueprint department is offline. The assembly line is running just fine, producing fluent-sounding speech, but it's often a jumble of meaningless words, what we sometimes call a word salad. And because their comprehension is gone, they are often completely unaware that they're not making any sense. This really captures the internal struggle of Broca's aphasia, doesn't it? Their mind is clear, the blueprint is perfect, they know what's wrong, but that assembly line just won't cooperate. You can only imagine how deeply frustrating that must be. And then you have the experience of Wernicke's aphasia, which is just a whole other world. The words are pouring out. That assembly line is going a mile a minute, but the blueprint department that gives it all meaning and quality control is just dark. This lack of awareness is a classic feature of the condition, and it's a direct result of their own broken comprehension. Okay, so we've seen what happens when one of the captains is down, but what if the phone line between them gets cut? Or what if some catastrophic event takes out both headquarters at the same time? Well, that leads us right into our next section on conduction and global aphasia. So first, let's talk about conduction aphasia. This is what we call a classic disconnection syndrome. The problem isn't actually in Broca's area or Wernicke's area, nope. The problem is in the highway of nerve fibers that connects them, a pathway known as the arcuate fasciculus. And here's how that broken connection plays out. Someone with conduction aphasia can understand you perfectly. Wernicke's area is working. But when you ask them to repeat a phrase, that signal from the blueprint department can't make it over to the assembly line. The path is broken. This creates a very specific, very telling problem. They have a terrible time trying to repeat things, even though their own spontaneous speech might be pretty good. And now we have to talk about the most severe form, global aphasia. This isn't just a problem with one area or one pathway. This is a massive, devastating blow to the entire language system. It wipes out both the ability to produce speech and the ability to understand it. The cause is usually a very large stroke that hits the middle cerebral artery. This artery is like a superhighway for blood, and it feeds the huge chunk of the brain where both Broca's and Wernicke's areas live. The result is just catastrophic. Speech is non-fluent, comprehension is poor, and the person is left with a near total inability to communicate. And all of this brings us to our final and maybe most important section,
As we pull all these pieces together, the one big lesson that becomes crystal clear is that language isn't just one spot in the brain, it's a network.
So, what's the big takeaway from all this? It's that language is a system, an interconnected network. You've got the producer, Broca's area, you've got the comprehender, Wernicke's area, and you have that critical connection between them, the arcuate fasciculus. And as we've seen, if you damage any single part of this network, whether it's one of the main centers or just the connection, the whole system breaks down in very specific and unfortunately very predictable ways.
And that kind of leaves us with one final big question to think about. Our ability to communicate, to share ideas, to tell stories, to connect with each other is so fundamental to our identity. So, if all of that is managed by this incredibly delicate interconnected network in our brain, how deeply does its breakdown really affect the very essence of who we are?